Now let me start with the story of slavery in America, because that's how Liberia begins. One of the realities of the United States of America, we certainly are a wonderful country, and we had a wonderful history, and we had great founding fathers. But the reality of our history is that our nation began with an institution of which we cannot be terribly proud. That institution is called slavery. And in fact, it was prompted by the need for cheap labor, in particular in the production of both tobacco and rice. By the end of the 18th century, it was reinforced by the demand, certainly in Europe and all over the world, for cotton. So, the way we got the cheap labor was that we brought Africans as slaves from Africa, and they were brought to the United States of America. When the Constitution was being written, there was a long discussion on slavery, and there were many people who felt that it should disappear, but there were very few people who were willing to give up their slaves. It sounded like a good idea. And in fact, any attempt to abolish slavery would have destroyed the United States at the very beginning. But it was generally assumed that slavery would vanish quickly. In fact, in the American Constitution, the slave trade is prohibited after 1808. The importing of slaves, I mean, that was it. So it was assumed it would fade away, but it didn't, because the rise of the cotton economy simply demanded more African slaves. So now this controversy continued, and of course, it created a series of positions. One position, of course, was the person who said, one extreme, slavery is just, it's justified by the Bible, God believes in it, and so forth and so on. So we keep the institution. At the other extreme were the abolitionists, who were few in number. Most of them were centered somewhere in New England, and they said, it's wrong, God hates it, it's a terrible institution, we have to get rid of it right away, right now. In the middle, there were two positions. One of the positions was slavery is wrong, but after all, people paid money for their slaves. And in fact, it would be too traumatic to end it quickly. So what we should do is simply let it fade away, and certainly what nice people would do if they didn't believe in it, having used their slaves for their entire life, when they die, they would free them. And in fact, that happened. There appeared in the United States of America large numbers of freed slaves. And they ended up in places like Philadelphia and New York and Boston and places like that. They were blacks and they were free. Well, that raised the question, what do you do with them? Do you give them the vote? The answer was universally no. Blacks could not vote in northern states, even if they were free. Well, do you send them to the same schools as white people? The answer was no. Slavery was wrong, but blacks are inferior. So you now had a group of freed slaves. Do you want them around? That led to the second position, which is called the deportationist position. The deportationist position was part of what we call the nativist policy. The nativist policy was the following. We hate slavery. We don't like slavery because slavery has brought a population into our country that doesn't fit. Africans don't belong here. And therefore what we should do is not enslave them, because by enslaving them they remain here. And by freeing them here, they what? Become part of our population. What we need to do is to deport them, to send them back to Africa and set them up in their own places. In that way, America will be freed of blacks, slavery will be gone, and we will be a nice, white, free nation believing in equality and democracy. Now, the deportationist policy was enthusiastically endorsed by many people in the North and people in the South, because there were freed blacks in the South and they were knowing what do you do with them? They had a status as slaves, but what do you do with them when they're free and they're making demands? So there was organized in America a society called the American Colonization Society, the purpose of which was to deport, to encourage, that is, blacks to freely leave the United States of America and return to their homeland, to Africa. Now, the people who were in the American Colonization Society, which was finally established by 1820, although there was a kind of premature attempt that began in 1808. The American Colonization Society was inspired by an example that already existed. It had been organized as the British Colonization Society in 1797. Why would the British be concerned about deporting blacks? Well, let me tell you what happened to them. As a result of the American Revolution, many blacks who were slaves fled into the British colonies that were not joined to the United States of America, like Nova Scotia, or even into what today we call Quebec and Ontario. Some of them actually fought with the British against the rebels because the rebels were slave owners. And after the Revolution, they didn't want to go home, they couldn't go home, so they ended up in London. And now in London, all these people who certainly don't believe in slavery are now living with blacks. So now, because they all believe in freedom, you know, the whole thing, they decide that most likely the best policy, since these people are unhappy and the fog and the whole thing, I mean, you know, is to send them back to sunny Africa. So they organized, and the society was organized by whites. It did not have a black president. It was a white president and a white organization. And they were going to decide what to do with the free Africans. They were going to encourage them to leave and go back. They didn't find overwhelming enthusiasm among the blacks. First of all, most blacks didn't know where their home was. I mean, no, they'd been taken. Obviously, they had a home, but they were taken, and they didn't know where to go. Where were they going to go? Did they come from the Guinea coast? Did they come from the Gold Coast? Were they Yoruba? Were they Mande? Were they Malinke? Were they Kwa? What were they? They didn't know. So, what does it mean going home? Plus, they had grown accustomed to what we call Western amenities. Were you going to dump them on an African shore and hand them a hoe and say, hello, goodbye? Plus, there were people living in the areas they were taking them to. Would they be friendly, even though they were black? Well, they didn't really think through this thing too well. All they knew was they wanted to get rid of the blacks. They didn't believe in slavery, and the best thing to do was to deport them back to Africa. So the British Colonization Society got off to a big start. They got money, 1797 actually. It was during the wars with Napoleon. You think they'd have better things to do with their time. So they came and they founded a colony. It is still there. It's right next to Liberia. It's called Sierra Leone, Mount Lion. Now, you can't find a lion in Sierra Leone today. I mean, you can in Huntington Woods, but you can't find a lion today in Sierra Leone. But it is presumed, because lions roamed over most of sub-Saharan Africa and north. I mean, most likely it was a place that was filled with lions at one time, and they were all killed and disposed of and whatever. So it's Mount Lion, and it was first discovered by the Portuguese. And what happened, the Portuguese started using it as a slave station. There was a little island up a river called Bunsey Island, and that was the slave post. And then what happened was blacks who fought with other blacks took their captives and sold them to the Portuguese. The Portuguese were replaced ultimately by the British. So Bunsey Island became a little British slave post, and so the Colonization Society got permission to dump the free blacks near Bunsey Island. So the ship sailed from London. They had a few hundred. Ultimately, they would bring several thousand of these people down to Sierra Leone. And right there at the mouth of the river, where Bunsey Island was, they built a town, which is now the capital of Sierra Leone. And the town expresses the idealism of these people. It's called Freetown. We have liberated you. We have returned you to your homeland. It's like returning me to 12th and Claremont. I mean, what? You know, what am I going to do? So as the flags are flying, the whole thing, they're returning them home. And they come in. The place is already occupied. There are African nations living there. So, of course, they push them away. And they built a little fort, and it's under the control of the whites, because the whites know what is best for blacks. You know that. So now there is Sierra Leone, and it's a precedent, right? And there's been a lot of trouble there, I must tell you, because the local people don't want the intruders, and there's resistance, and the whites aren't terribly concerned about the welfare of the people they have brought. They want them somehow to turn to agricultural pursuits in a place where there seem to be no markets for whatever they would grow, and people living at subsistence agriculture. It was really trying. So there were a few rebellions, you know, all that kind of a thing. But that message didn't get to New York. All they knew in New York was a successful attempt had been made by the British. So they were gung-ho now. They knew the place exactly where they would go. They would go to the same area. Right next door to Freetown in Sierra Leone was this kind of empty, and what does it mean, empty? Empty territory, and they would simply go. They would take with them several thousand freed blacks who had been encouraged voluntarily to leave the United States of America and to return to their homeland. So they landed in 1821. They were little to the south or southeast of Sierra Leone, and they had a name already. Land of the free. How do you say free? Liberty. The name of the country is Liberia, Liberty Land. Oh, that's it. You are free, so it's now called Liberia. All right, fine. And now they find the mouth of a river, which is called the St. Paul River, and there they establish a little fort, which, since they're Christian, they call Christopolis, which is a Greek name meaning city of Christ. Fine. It's not a city, do you understand? And then they think better. Since they're Americans, and the President of the United States of America at that time is James Monroe, they name the town after him. They call it Monrovia. It still is the capital of Liberia. And they dump the people down there in Monrovia, and now they say, and not only that, this place is called Liberia. So the freed slaves ask a question. What if we need help? Will the American government help us in the way that the British government helps Sierra Leone? Answer, no, because America does not believe in having colonies. The British do. We don't. I know, but, you know, like a cup of sugar, I mean, you know. Well, don't worry. There is the American Colonization Society. Do you understand? They're headquartered in New York City, and they are prepared to send you whatever you need. In fact, we'll send you a governor. His name is Buchanan. Now, you have to understand, you're not an American colony because America has no colonies. But you're under the control of the American Colonization Society, which is headquartered in New York. And you have a governor who's a white governor who understands everything about what you need. His name is Buchanan. In fact, one of the towns in Liberia next to Monrovia, as you go along the shore, is called Buchanan. It's named after that governor. And so that they settle down, and they're given a hoe and whatever else it is, and a piece of land. There are people there in fishing villages along the coast. They're driven away. Are they happy about being driven away? No. Do they have the power to drive out these people? No, because they have guns. And so Liberia begins as a series of small villages that line the coast of the Atlantic on the Guinea coast. So what I now have to explain is the context of Sierra Leone and Liberia in terms of all of Africa. I mean, why this coast? Now, the European explorers of Africa came by sea, not by land. So they identified the different places by various names. They would have what's called the Congo coast, because the Congo River emptied out there, and in fact, there was an African nation called the Congo who lived in the area, and then there was an African nation called the Angola that lived south of it, so this was the Angola coast, the Congo coast, and then, because they presumed that there was gold in the area, they called the curve the Gold Coast, and then around the curve, they called it the Grain Coast or the Guinea Coast, because they found certain veggies or plants that seemed to be useful that they took with them, because they would stop there on fueling operations on their way to go around the Cape of Good Hope. So the coast received various names. The Guinea Coast can only be understood by understanding Africa as a whole. I've done this on previous occasions, but I will remind you of this very simple division of Africa. North Africa is a huge desert. It's called the Sahara, and in parts is almost impenetrable. It is not a place where people choose to live. It's a place where people cross. All right, I mean, they go from the Mediterranean down below the Sahara. Below the Sahara, and it touches part of the Guinea coast, is a grassland, because there's now rain. And the grassland is like an American prairie. There's tall grass, and in some cases, as you get closer to the desert, it becomes scrub. But it's open and flat. And in fact, the Arab word for the prairie is Sudan. So we say prairie, Russians say steppe, and Africans say Sudan. The Sudan isn't just the country which is called the Sudan. The country, the Sudan, is in the Sudan, but it's not the whole Sudan. The Sudan stretches all the way from the Red Sea across Africa to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a whole section, and in fact, it's open to farming. And it's there that basically what we call the Negro race emerged. Now, south of the Sudan, and that takes the southern coast of the Guinea coast and the Gold Coast, there is a rainforest. At the farther south you go, there's more and more rain. It's less and less dry. And then all of a sudden it turns into the rainforest. We have a pejorative word for an African rainforest. We call it a jungle. All right, fine. But it's a rainforest. And in fact, it's very thick. And in fact, human beings don't like to live in the middle of a forest. Humans evolved on the plains, we call it the savanna, something like the Sudan. If they're living in the middle of a forest where they have no vistas, then they're there because they were driven there by people who occupied their place up in the prairie. So the rainforest will ultimately be filled up by people who lived in the prairie and were driven down into the rainforest. Now, the people who lived in the Sudan and ultimately the rainforest, the people who lived in the rainforest were the first people who were there. The people who lived in the Sudan were the people who pushed those people down into the rainforest. So let me give you the names of the groups, because all of them are represented in Liberia. That is, the Americans came and they took a piece of real estate. They had no idea of who the people were who lived there. They didn't know their nationality. They didn't care about their language. They didn't care at all. They wanted a piece of real estate. All they knew was that there was a place to take. And in fact, they landed in the rainforest. So let me try to describe the place where they landed. The Guinea coast can be divided up into two areas. Along the coast, there are all these rivers that come off the mountains and flow into the Atlantic. So you have a flat plain covered with trees and swamp at the mouth of the river. Got this thing? It's a little bit like New Orleans, only multiply it, all right? There are all these rivers, and they come off the mountains. Behind the plain in the Guinea coast, following the coast, is a line of mountains. And in fact, the rivers start up in the mountains and run down the mountains, and the mountains are covered with lush rainforests. The mountains also became very important ultimately for the story of this area, because in the mountains there are precious metals. One of them is iron. The other one is gold. That's why the area next to the Guinea coast was called the Gold Coast. And that gold was discovered over 1,200 years ago. And that was to produce a history. That is, the area to which these people came had a history. We tend to think that places have no history before Europeans arrive. No, that was the beginning of America. Well, America began with Columbus, didn't it? Was there anybody here before Columbus? Did they have a history? Did they have a life? No. When we arrived, do you understand? There was a life. So that's the beginning. No population before, no history. Did Michigan have a history before Cadillac? No. Well, they did. They had a history, and a fairly distinguished history. What happened was, history means that people organize themselves. First they start as families, then they become clans, then they become tribes, then they become nations. And in fact, political development is stimulated by economic development. And the economic development was stimulated by a trade route. The trade route had at its southern end the gold mines up in the mountains. And the other end was up in Morocco, where they had salt. There was very little salt available down here. So it's interesting. Would you trade your gold teeth for salt? I don't know. I think you might if what? If you were desperate for salt. You need salt for survival. So the people up north, whether they were the Romans or the Arabs, brought the salt down to the Sudan. And in fact, the people in the Sudan organized themselves to mine the gold and to exchange the gold for the salt, and out of it came 3 rather large kingdoms. One of them was called Ghana. It doesn't correspond to what today is called Ghana. They just stole the name. The second one was called Mali. There is a country called Mali in the place. Mali is named after the nation, the African nation in the Sudan that was in charge of the empire, the Malinke. So it's called Mali. And the third was called the Songhai. And they became very, very rich. Somewhere in the 10th and 11th century, Arab traders coming on the trade route brought with them not only salt, they brought with them a religion. That religion is called Islam. So, overwhelming numbers of the people in the Sudan were converted to Islam. And in fact, it became a very important part of the Muslim world. Ultimately, under the Songhai and later, a great city was built, which I saw in the area. It was a black city. Its name is Timbuktu. You've heard of it? All right, well you've heard of Timbuktu? My mother at one time, I think I may have told the story, said to me, Sherwin, she said, you're traveling everywhere. I guess you'll even go to Timbuktu. So she said that, annoyed. So I said, well, if she said it, I'm going. So I went to Timbuktu. I was there, the whole thing, and it was very, very impressive. Now, what happened in the area was, as one nation replaced another in charge of the empire, the defeated nations were driven into the rainforest. So by the time we get to the 19th century, there are lots of people living in the rainforest. So now I have to describe the people in the rainforest, who they are. The oldest group, and all their languages are related. And by the way, the boundaries you're looking at now, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Togo, Benin, all those boundaries are boundaries drawn by European powers in the 19th century. They have nothing at all to do with the nations who live there. All of these countries contain many nations. Each of them contains many nations because nobody cared about their boundaries. So, The oldest group in the rainforest. They most likely were up in the Sudan and then were driven into the rainforest. They ended up along the coast. The people are called the Kwa people. And the Kwa people stretch all the way from Liberia to Nigeria. In fact, the most famous of the Kwa people are the Yoruba, who are in Nigeria, from which group most of the blacks in America come. So those are the Kwa. All right, you got the Kwa. All right. Now, the enemy of the Kwa, who drove them into the rainforest, are called the Mandinke people. In fact, Alex Haley claims to be descended from the Mandinke. When he wrote the book Roots, do you remember that book? The Mandinke came in next. They're the ones who created the great empire of Mali, and they drove the Kwa down. But then, that's what history does, the Mandinke got their comeuppance, because now arrived the Songhai. And the Songhai sweep through the Sudan, and the next thing you know, they drive them, a good part of the Mandinke down into the rainforest, where they bump into the Kwa. Now the Kwa and the Mandinke, Malinke, Mande, they have various names, hate each other. And quite frankly, if in the southeastern part of Liberia there are Kwa, in the northwestern part of Liberia there are Mandinke. Now, did the people landing from New York, Governor Buchanan, know Kwa Mandinke? Nobody knows. Make a slice of real estate here. So what he took was an area filled with two groups of tribes and nations who had been historic enemies, and pasted them together as what? As a kind of American colony, although America refused to acknowledge that it was an American colony. Already, can you see the trouble? Do you feel the trouble? Now a third group arrives. Who are the third group? The third group are these people, lucky people, who come from New York, Baltimore, Boston, whatever, who are being shipped to the area. Do they speak Kwa? Do they speak Mandinke? No! They speak English. Oh, I see. And in fact, they have been converted to the religion of the whites in North America, which is Protestant, Baptist, whatever religion. They most likely even eat grilled cheese sandwiches. I don't know. I mean, their culture has not, and no longer has anything to do with this area. And they're dumped there. So now there's a third group, right? There are two groups, and now there is a third group, and they're along the coast, and they have behind them the American Colonization Society. Got the setting for this place? All right, good. So now what is going to happen to this American colony that America refuses to call its own colony? It is an American colony. Well, what happens is that after a while, some of the people who were dumped say, we don't want a governor from New York. We want our own. And there was a very enterprising man who belonged to the group that came from the United States, a black man. His name was Jenkins Roberts. And he says, I'm the governor. And in fact, he gets the support of the settlers in the villages. They're dirt poor, whatever it be. And he's chosen the governor. Buchanan has already left, and the American Colonization Society accepts it. In fact, in 1847, Jenkins Roberts, if you go through Liberia, everything's named after Roberts. There's a Roberts Port, a Roberts Airport, a Roberts Toilet. I mean, everything's named after Roberts. All right. So Roberts in 1847, which, as you know, is very important in the history of Detroit. In 1847, we, the Detroiters, we were the capital of Michigan. In 1847, it was taken from us, and they created an artificial nothing in the middle of the state, which is called Lansing. So that's year burns with great resentment in my heart, anyway. So. But in 1847, in that very same year, this group of settlers, since America won't acknowledge it as a colony, simply declare their independence. However, they're not independent because they depend on the largesse of the American Colonization Society, and they need more people to come over because they're a little afraid. For some reason, the natives aren't happy that they're there. Up until 1860, the Colonization Society, until the beginning of the Civil War, will exist. And they sent over about 10,000 people. Of the 10,000 they send over, half managed to get back to the United States. They don't want to be there. You know, had they recruited me, I most likely I would have found a boat, a ship, or something. I would go back. I mean, there are no amenities. So half go back, half remain, but the half that remain are supplemented by another group, and I have to tell you who they are. They're called the Congo. At the beginning of the 19th century, Great Britain decided to abolish the slave trade. And in fact, Great Britain then used the British Navy to stop ships carrying slaves and to free them. So there were British ships all along here, and in fact, they would stop ships. They would free the slaves, but what do you do with them? Do you take them back to London? So they stopped off at Freetown in Sierra Leone and dumped some of them. And then they stopped off in Monrovia and dumped the others. So over time, thousands of rescued slaves who came from other parts of Africa are dumped by the British in Monrovia. And they join this freed slave group because they're also freed slaves. Now, until today, people still make a distinction. It's like San Francisco. If your ancestors came in 1849, if they came in January of 1850, finished. You're in you're in another group. All right, so there's a distinction. But we call this the settler population, and the settler population gets a name because they're like invaders. They're like white people coming into somebody else's country. They're called Creoles. And the Creole population consists of two groups. Those descended from the freed slaves coming from the United States of America, and those descended from the people rescued from the slave ships by the British and dumped in Monrovia. Does any one of them know where they originally came from? Most likely no. Now comes one of the most interesting developments of all. You would think that having endured the humiliation of slavery, that they would never impose it on other people. Wrong. The only role model they had were plantations with plantation owners. And now they were in their own place, and just as they were looked down on by the whites, they in turn looked down on the people who were there as savages. So this little group of people who landed now take over. And in fact, they create their own plantations where they will grow agricultural things, cassava, whatever else it is, a little rice, whatever, and they need cheap labor. So now they will go into the interior, do you understand? They've got guns, and they will raid, and they will bring back forced labor, no slaves. So now they become plantation owners. And now they declare themselves, in an imitation of the United States of America, to be an independent republic. And they always claimed, we're the one place in Africa that is what? Free. Except Liberia was really an American colony. A group of American blacks came to the area, do you understand? Enslaved the local blacks and created their own version of a colony. In fact, they constituted somewhere no more than 5% of the entire population of Liberia. Yet they owned all the what? All the land, and they instituted forced labor. Not only that, there was a scandal at the end of the 19th century where they were selling forced labor to Europeans. So this is a problematic group. Had they learned the lesson of slavery? If you ask them, are you opposed to slavery? Yes, we hate it, hate it, hate it, hate it. Well, you have a republic, and everybody who's a member of the Creoles can vote. Do you think that all these other people, the Mandingo people and the Kwa people, they should vote? No, they're savages. They have to be civilized. Thank you. I want to tell you that that condition lasted in Liberia until 1946, and for all practical purposes until 1980. So, a country or a colony or a settlement that was supposed to celebrate the liberation of blacks turns out to be something like a European colony, where the ruling class is black and the lower class is black. One of the lessons you learn from history is that suffering does not make people noble. In fact, what happens is they wish to impose the same cruelty on others that they themselves experience. It's a falsehood. So Liberia turns out to be this, well, is it good for the settlers? Is after a while they get used to the place, do you understand? It's wonderful. They're in charge. In fact, they organize themselves like America. They organize political parties, but only 5% of the population can vote. And they have a name, since one of the parties in America that was opposed to slavery was called the Whig Party. Remember, in the middle of the 19th century? They called themselves the Whig Party. But there were two Whig parties that were arguing with each other, so one Whig party called itself the True Whig Party. I mean, that's like going to a restaurant. And they say, and it says on the menu, fresh salad. Does that mean that you, on occasion, serve stale salad? I mean, is that available? Is that an alternative? What do you mean fresh? It's a salad. I assume it'll be fresh. Well, they do that. So now it's the true Whig as opposed to the other Whig fan. So they have, and in fact, the Whig Party has no opposition. They all agree. The purpose of the true Whig Party is to make sure that the settlers, the Creoles, stay in charge. So they create an imitation of what they endured back in North Carolina, South Carolina, wherever it was. Only now the ruling class are the former slaves. And not only that, one of the things they noticed in Virginia and South Carolina, North Carolina, is that the aristocracy there all joined the Masons. So they create, they have Masonic temples all over Liberia. They all join the Masons. Does it have a touch of absurd? Do you understand? You've come to Africa, and now you land at Monrovia, and there's the Masonic temple. In order to be anybody among the Creole society, you must belong to the Masons. And in fact, anybody of any consequence who assumed any leadership was a member of the Masons, and they all went around with their little aprons and whatever. They were a total and absolute imitation of the Virginia aristocracy. And in fact, they had names were obviously Anglo-Saxon, Tubman, Tolbert, whatever it was, those were their names. And the people in the interior, they were a labor supply. And sometimes they went into the interior, they raided, and they brought back what? People to work on the plantations, most of which were along the coast. Now, during the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the country experienced problems. You have to understand, in the 1880s, the European powers conquered all of Africa. There was no part of Africa that was an independent country, with the exception of two, Liberia and Ethiopia. Ethiopia's on the east. But then when I was a child, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia and made it part of the Italian Empire, leaving Liberia the what? The only independent, theoretically independent country in Africa. So, what were the problems? Well, the first were the boundaries. When the American Colonization Society had come, they had taken a huge swath of territory. But in the 1870s and 1880s, there now arrived the French, who were trying to create for themselves an empire in Africa. And they inserted themselves, and the next thing you know, Liberia loses half of its territory. And now it has Sierra Leone, which is a British colony to its west. But now to the north and to the east, there appear two French colonies. One is called Guinea, and the other one is called, in English, the Ivory Coast. Now, I want to tell you something about these countries. They have the same people in them as are in Liberia. Because if you cross over to the Ivory Coast, they have in them Kwa people and Mandinke people. And if you go north into Guinea, you'll find some Kwa people and you will find Mandinke people, because the boundaries have nothing at all to do with the nations who were there. But Liberia now is smaller. It's forced to shrink. The second thing, the second problem, obviously, is that the United States of America loses interest in them. I mean, after the Civil War, there's no slavery, right? And in fact, deporting blacks is no longer the policy. So now they're not receiving a lot of help from the United States of America, and they were accustomed to receiving it. So it's sort of isolating. The third problem they have is basic. The natives, Kwa and Mandinke, hate them. Hate them. So they're in the same situation as white plantation owners in South Carolina. They've got a population of people who hate them. The only advantage they have is that the Mandinke people and the Kwa people hate each other. Do you understand? So if you can play their resentments against each other, then you can control them. History has I mean, if you're not suffering through it, is delicious. Is this not? No, is this not? I mean, the irony of this entire situation. And last, there's no middle class. The settlers want to be plantation owners. They don't go into business. But you have to import-export. I mean, you got to do something. I mean, you got to have somebody doing import-export. And the lower class are forced labor working on the land. So in the 1890s, there will now arrive a group of people who got there by accident. In the 1890s, large numbers of Christians were leaving the Ottoman Empire because the economy was rotten. Most of them were coming from what today we call Lebanon. So we call them the Lebanese. And they would not have referred to themselves as Arabs because although they spoke Arabic, they were not Muslim. And So they thought of themselves as descended from the Phoenicians or somebody, or a people that was there before the Arabs, whatever, but they were leaving in large numbers. Many of them made their way to Europe, in particular France. Many of them made their way to North America and to Detroit. But some of them got rerouted. Some of the people who promised to take them to France or to North America, in particular North America, dropped them off in Africa. And once they were dropped off, they then brought their relatives. They were dropped off everywhere you go in West Africa. The leaders of the business class are Lebanese, invariably. They're segregated, they have their own clubs, whatever it be. They are the business class. They have the stores, the main stores. So the Lebanese are in Senegal, they are in Guinea, they are in Sierra Leone, they are in Liberia, they're on the Ivory Coast, they're in Ghana, they're in Togo. I mean, wherever you go, they're there. So now they land. It's a great opportunity because what? Nobody's doing a grocery. It's an open thing for a middle class. So now, oddly enough, and this is, when you go there, it's rather interesting. In the middle of Monrovia, there's a Lebanese country club. So the Lebanese now arrive, and by the way, they improve the economy because they provide the what? The middle class. Can they identify with the ruling class? No, they're black. Can they identify with the lower classes? They don't want to identify with the lower classes. They remain a kind of segregated community. Do they become Liberian patriots? Liberia is like an artificial country to them. I mean, no, I mean, of course not. Can they make money? Yes. Are they successful? Yes. So they are a stimulus to the economy. And things roll along this way until 1926. And now in 1926, I'm going to mention a word which now creates problems in America. Not when I was a child. Those are the tires we rode on. I'll give you the name. Don't be disturbed. Firestone. Remember that? Remember Firestone? All right. Firestone. So Firestone, of course, out of Akron, whatever it is now part of what we call the American automobile age. In fact, the Fords and the Firestones will ultimately marry the dynasties. One makes the cars, the other what? Makes the tires. They go together, and for tires you need rubber. Where do you get rubber from? Well, they used to get it, you can get it from Brazil, you can get it from Indonesia. The problem with Brazil was it was politically unstable. So they wanted a place where they could control the country. So in 1926, and by now what? Automobile production is really moving forward. All of a sudden, a Firestone shows up in Liberia. The Americans haven't been interested in Liberia for what? A long, long time, but now they're interested in Liberia. Why are they interested in Liberia? Well, they figure Liberia, with its historic American connection, might be a good place to grow rubber trees. So in 1926, they move into Liberia. And I do want to tell you, they take over Liberia. In fact, for several decades, Liberia will be called the Firestone Republic. Now, is the ruling class happy? Of course they're happy. Because indeed, it will simply mean what? Money. Because they'll have to buy the land from them, the whole thing. So, the ruling class, the Creoles, are making money hand over fist. Firestone is very, very happy. I do want to tell you that in the Second World War, when the Dutch East Indies, one of the major sources of rubber, was taken over by the Japanese, we had Liberia. In fact, something existed in Liberia in the Second World War that isn't there anymore. It's gone, it's destroyed. It's a first-class airport, international airport, where American plane, they took the, whatever it was, people in, people out, the rubber out. They built a port, a magnificent port. From 1926 until 1944, the thing simply grew, and it was very clear that the people who ran Liberia were the Creoles. But the Creoles made a lot of their money because their homes got very big from the Firestones and from rubber. So now what you need are huge amounts of cheap labor. Do the Creoles want to work on the rubber trees? Oh, please. They just want to bank the money. So now you have to go to the Kwa and the what? The Mandinke, get some forced labor, have them work on the rubber trees, and the whole thing. Do they get much benefit from it? No, they get some employment, all right? In fact, areas that should be devoted to growing food are now devoted for exports, for rubber trees, and two, they now decide to add two more exports, cocoa and coffee. Oh, but you can't eat, you can eat cocoa. I can eat chocolate all day, so I'm sure you can eat cocoa, cacao, if you want to. But now it's focused on export. So the poverty of 95% of the people is absolutely intense. 5% of the people who are black are what? Living very comfortably. They've got their clubs and they've got their plantations and they've got whatever else it is. It's very nice. And now America is very interested in them. The United States of America can't lose them because what? Rubber comes from there. It's the Firestone Republic, rescued by the Firestones. In fact, in 1944, there will arrive to power one of the famous figures. I remember his coming to the United States of America and being feted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a great ally because in World War II we were totally dependent on Liberian rubber. His name was William Tubman, and he was described as the only leader of the only free country in Africa. William Tubman was a Creole. What he did, however, since we were fighting a war for democracy, in 1946, for public relations, he declared that the franchise is now extended to everybody. Wow, everybody? You mean all those Mandinke, all those Kwa? If they get the vote, they're going to overthrow you. Don't worry. Now you have to understand, in order to vote, you can be a Creole, you can be a Kwa, you can be a what? A Mandinke, whatever you want to be. But you have to own property. Well, that disqualifies what? That disqualifies almost all the Kwa and all the Mandinke. And that means the Creoles who do have property, what? We used to have a requirement like that in the United States of America. At the beginning of the United States of America, we didn't have universal suffrage until Andrew Jackson. You had to own property in order to vote. So now, you're still back, now instead of being 5% of the population, it's 6% of the population. But now when somebody asks Tubman, do you have universal suffrage in your, yes! Anybody can vote, and then he forgets the little subordinate clause. Wait, who owns property? No, anybody can vote. And everybody, oh, Tubman, he's a great guy. And I remember we thought he was such a terrific person, and he most likely was. He was nice to his mother, he was nice to his wife, he was nice to his kids, and the whole thing, he was great. Good speaker. And in fact, he reigned from 1944 to 1971 as the president of Liberia. And it was still, to a large degree, the Firestone Republic. And it had become important to the United States of America, and it became even more important because during his reign, I shouldn't say reign, during his presidency, right? During his presidency, The Cold War started. So now you got the Soviet Union and the Russians, and here are all these poor people. It's the perfect place for what? Communists to come to stir up trouble. So America is looking for nations in Africa that are reliable. Many of them have achieved their independence, certainly after 1960 or 61. So Liberia is doubly useful. And we say very nice things about Tubman, and nobody talks about the fact that almost nobody votes in Liberia. Why would we want to cause trouble? Why would we want to start up? You want to start up trouble? Why would you want to start up trouble? So now, in 1971, Tubman dies. By then, the Cold War turned very hot in Vietnam. Do you remember that? The Vietnam War was still sort of coming down in 1971, and he is replaced by another man whose first name is William, and his name rhymes with Claudette Colbert. Only his name is Tolbert. It's pronounced not Tolbert, it's pronounced Tolbert. His name is William Tolbert. And he belongs to the Creole aristocracy and the whole thing. He now becomes the president. And the man was a buffoon. Because he would invent these lines. I'll give you one of his lines. But he wanted to present himself to the world as a person who was very concerned about his people. My aim in Liberia is to move everybody from mats to mattresses. That was the famous. You like that? That's pretty good. All right. Except he didn't do anything like that. He just drove around in a big Mercedes. And I do want to tell you that rubber and the exports of coffee and cacao and whatever else it is simply what? Increased the wealth of this Creole aristocracy. And they were obviously paraded. Blacks were always proud of Liberia. Because Liberia was the only, independent, for a long while, was the only independent black nation in Africa. After 1960, that wasn't the case, but that was it. Meanwhile, most of the blacks in Liberia were seething with rage. And then it happened. So let me try to describe the event. You may remember it. I remember it vividly because the action was on television. April 12th, 1980. Tolbert had been president for 9 years. That's only 26 years ago. What has happened is the rice crisis. Rice was one of the staple foods is one of the staple foods in Liberia. It generally, some of it's grown locally, a large part of it is imported. Almost all the other basic foods, in order to keep the people happy, were price controlled and subsidized, but rice wasn't. So what happened was there was a fall in the price of rice on the international market, and many of the rice growers in Liberia were forced to sell their rice to the distributors cheap. But then William Tolbert, the president, decides, stupidly, that in order to encourage rice growers in Liberia to continue to grow rice, he would raise the price. So now people who sold cheap were forced to buy their rice back expensive. So what, do you understand? The poor are victimized. So what happens is riots start. They come out into the streets, screaming, screaming, screaming. He sends his soldiers out. They start shooting. So they kill a few people. That only what? Enrages the mob even more. And there's this built-up resentment. The resentment doesn't go back to 1944. The resentment goes back to 1821. It's just been building up, building up, building up, building up. So, The military gets into it. There aren't enough Creoles with enough sons to fill the military. So they're forced to recruit military people from the Kwa and the Mandinka. They cannot rise high in the hierarchy, you understand. But they can make master sergeant. Well, that's pretty good. Better than private. Now, what happens on April the 12th, 1980, is that a master sergeant by the name of Samuel Doe, D-O-E, he's a man in his 20s, takes a group of fellow soldiers and storms the presidential palace. He catches Tolbert in his bedroom, and what he proceeds to do is he mutilates him. Cuts off an ear, cuts off an eye, whatever. I mean, just slashes the whole thing. It's like blood's running all over the place. And then, I mean, they're all caught by surprise because, quite frankly, had the Kwa and the Mandinka thought about it earlier, they might have been able to do it. They just, they weren't empowered. But now they've got the reason, they got the mobs behind them, and the next thing he arrests the whole government. He calls a people's court. And the 13 main ministers of the government, they're all Creoles. I remember it, maybe you remember this scene, it's 1980, are taken to the beach. They're tied to stakes. And there are TV cameras. By the way, their humiliation is filmed. Anybody from Paris, do you understand, till LA is able to watch it. This is the old aristocracy. It's a little bit like Marie Antoinette in Paris in 1793. So they whip them, they take them to the beach, and then they tie them to the posts, and then they whip them, and then they kill them. And then mayhem breaks out. Because now the soldiers and the mobs go into all the houses, do you understand, of the Creoles, and they rip everything out, and they destroy everything, and they kill the people who are there. Sometimes they chop off an arm, sometimes they chop off a head, sometimes they disembowel them, whatever it be. I remember the film. It was overwhelming. The rage of 2 centuries is not directed to the whites. It's directed to the blacks, the black aristocracy. And now Samuel Doe declares himself the ruler of Liberia. He plans on writing a new constitution, but it may take a little while. And he's now in charge. Who's his government? Well, he is a Kwa. Not only is he a Kwa, he belongs to one of the sub-nations of the Kwa. They're called the Kron. They live way off in eastern Liberia, and they've been terribly persecuted, suffering enormous assaults of forced labor. He's a Kron, so now every member of his government is a what? Not only a Kwa, every member of his government is a Kron, a member of his tribe. He waits 5 years before he issues a new constitution and holds an election. Guess who wins? He wins the election. He is now the president, and something will happen, and this is very interesting. This is why it's so important for us to hear this story. The United States of America at that time is ruled by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is concerned about Soviet expansion. The Soviets have already, entered into Afghanistan, right? Remember the invasion of Afghanistan? The trouble with Ayatollah Khomeini has already begun. We need whatever allies we can find in Africa. So now what will happen is Ronald Reagan sends his congratulations to Samuel Doe and says, "We're so glad to have you as a friend. We applaud you. We need you. Thank you. You think we were friends of Tolbert and Tubman. Forget it. I mean, we love you, love you, love you, love you, love you. And we're glad you brought stability to Liberia. In addition, another nation is looking for friends in Africa. They're very good at providing security. It's called Israel. Israel's an ally of the United States of America, so the Israelis show up. They will provide a presidential guard for Samuel Doe, second to none. Now, during his presidency, I do want to tell you, students who riot are killed. The university is frequently, there's a university now in Monrovia, is frequently closed down, the whole thing. Anybody who protests against the government is arrested and put into jail. If you organize an opposition party, which is legal, they say it's legal, but if you organize it, then what? The leader of the party is generally arrested and put into jail, so the whole thing. So now Doe, and the other problem with Doe is, he's nuts. I mean, it's a small, it's just a small, it happens with megalomania. So he doesn't know how to restrain himself because he doesn't know how to use violence skillfully. He just uses it broadly, disembowels, whatever he does. So he's hard to defend. In fact, during this period of time, the United States builds the largest American embassy in Africa in Monrovia. But he has his enemies. One of his enemies is basically a Mande Mandinke. He comes from a subgroup. They're called the Gio Mano group. And they're up in northern Liberia. They don't like the Kwa. Doe is a what? A Kwa. His name is Charles Taylor. He ultimately, his mother comes from the Creoles, and his father comes basically from the Gio, Mano, Don people. So, and he basically escapes Liberia. He goes to, travels around, but ultimately, he comes back, and he's hired by Doe, who wants to have affirmative action. And he's in charge of finance. But then what is discovered is that he has embezzled funds. So he now flees to America, to Boston. And now the Liberian government, which has a treaty of extradition with the United States of America, asks America, which is now a big ally, to return, do you understand, return Taylor. Taylor is arrested. He's put in jail. But he's a crafty guy, sort of a handsome guy, sort of crafty, handsome, and he cuts the bars in his cell, and like a movie, and he escapes, and he makes his way back to West Africa, and he finds a friend. The friend, a man who hates Doe, is, even though he belongs to the Kwa, is the president of the Ivory Coast, whose name is Houphouët-Boigny. The reason why he hates Doe is that his niece was married to William Tolbert, and she was massacred. So he gives refuge to Charles Taylor, who now organizes a rebel army. He gets money, and he goes traveling around the area. All the people who hate Doe, he gets money not only from the Ivory Coast, he gets money from the ruler, the president of the Burkina Faso, whatever else. And now it comes on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1989. Charles Taylor, with his rebel force, invades Liberia to overthrow Samuel Doe. So he moves in, mayhem, killing, the whole thing, whatever else it is. He pushes Doe's forces all the way back to Monrovia, but Doe is able to hold on. Meanwhile, one of his chief generals defects from him, Charles Taylor, and organizes a third group, and now there are three groups in Liberia, and they're fighting each other, and they're mutilating, and they're burning, and they're killing, and the whole thing. Whatever plantations there are gone, the airport is ruined, everything. It's a civil war. It will go on until 1996. Ultimately, the United Nations will intrude, and they will persuade Nigeria, as the leader of the nations of West Africa, to organize an army and to go to Monrovia to establish order. It comes. It takes Monrovia. It fires Doe. Doe, foolishly, by the way, wanders into a conference with a man by the name of Johnson, who was the defecting general from Charles Taylor. And this is on the TV screen. I saw it. When Johnson sees Doe, comes through the door, he has like a scimitar, or whatever you want to call it. Off with one ear, off with another. And he says to Doe, "You've put money in Swiss banks, and you're going to tell me where you put the money." And Doe says, "No!" Off with the arm. Off with the arm. Disembowels him. I mean, it's almost do you understand? It's an almost unbelievable scene of blood and horror. Doe is dead. So now the occupying force that has Monrovia replaces him with their own government. So now there are three groups, but then there's a group of Doe people still surviving who reorganize themselves. So now there are four groups, and now there is what? Mayhem. The whole country, whatever Firestone did for Liberia, what? Gone. Whatever airport, whatever roads, whatever ports, whatever safety, whatever schools, whatever it was, between 1989 and 1995, it goes down the drain or up in flames, and nobody knows how to stop this entire thing. And the question is, what if Charles Taylor wins from the American point of view? He hates us. In fact, he received his military training after his escape from Libya. Did we do the wrong thing? Well, we never do the wrong thing. We never back the wrong ally. We never waste money. Do we ever do things like that? We never do silly things like that. What's going to happen? Now, most people watching television, they just go like this. Oh, disembowelment. It looks like a movie I saw yesterday. Oh. Right? They don't care. Was anybody in this room interested in, overwhelmed by the horrors going on in Liberia, where 250,000 people were killed in this country of 3 million people, and 1 million refugees in camps all over the place? Huh? So if you want to find out what happened, come back in 5 minutes.
Yo, what's up, baby? Want to learn some history? Check it out, check it out.
Your GED right here, guaranteed, man. Come on, check
Hey, how you doing? Educational videos, top quality, right here.
I got live learning, beautiful books inside.
The National Center for Family Literacy.
Yo, I got your arithmetic right here.
Because you can't get your GED on the street. Call 1-877-FAM-LIT1 for free learning programs like GED and family computer classes.
Who needs a high school diploma, huh?
The National Center for Family Literacy, the first step to a better life.
So my question is, so how's it all resolved? In the 1990s, this incredible war, I mean, in Rwanda, we all know about that genocide, there were about 500,000, so this is half. 250,000 people slaughtered. Well, the complications never cease, so now let me try to describe the resolution. Charles Taylor, who is now struggling to take Monrovia, I mean, there are 4 groups here now. There's a group led by Nigeria that's occupied Monrovia. There is the leftovers of Dough's army, that's 2. 3, there's a defecting general from Charles Taylor, Prince Johnson, and he's off here in the west. And then coming from the east is Charles Taylor with his army, but he's having a hard time. And then he finds an ally. In Sierra Leone, the same thing happens as in Liberia. The natives rise up against the Creoles, and there is a terrible civil war. The man who leads the tribal army is a man by the name of Sanko. And Sanko is he crazy, is he mad, who knows what. He kidnaps young children, sometimes 8 or 9 years old, and gives them rifles. And in fact, since they've lost their parents, he becomes their parent. The psychology of it. And he now uses them to kill their parents on occasion, and to now go anywhere in Sierra Leone and just kill, 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 filled with the same resentment, you understand, of the old Creole class. Because Sierra Leone's story is very similar to the story in Liberia, except Sierra Leone was British and Liberia was founded by blacks from America. That same small Creole ruling class, do you understand? All these years of resentment, and now it breaks out, and now all you need is a crazy man to organize it. Now the problem is that in Sierra Leone, one of the largest diamond mines in the world was discovered, except the diamond mine is in the territory of the rebels. When I was in Abidjan, Abidjan is the capital of the Ivory Coast in the main hotel there, I met a Lebanese person who was into diamonds. And I asked him what he was going to do, why he was there. He said, I'm going up to Sierra Leone. If you make enough money, you're willing to what? To take enough risk. He was going to go into this rebel territory. I mean, now these rebels, and maybe you read the story, wherever they went, and they used the kids to do this often. This is one of the things. Mutilation is one of the characteristics of the war there. They cut off the legs and the arms. Leave the victim alive. So I remember the New York Times had story after story about the victims in Sierra Leone. I mean, so this is like a local characteristic, whatever. And so there are all these victims of this horror and the intimidation, and this man is going to get diamonds? But, so now Sierra Leone is very important to people because diamonds are what? Money, 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 and the rebels have the diamonds, so already there are all kinds of national governments out there that want to see this rebel group defeated. However, Charles Taylor knows Sanko. because they were both trained in how to run a rebellion by Mr. Gaddafi in Libya. And Sanko says, don't worry, Charles, or Chuck, whatever he calls him, I don't know. Don't worry, I'll help you. So now what happens in Liberia is, coming out of Sierra Leone is the revolutionary rebel army of Mr. Sanko with his 8-year-old soldiers lopping off limbs, and they enter into Liberia to support Charles Taylor. And they now wreak the same devastation. There's so many limbs being cut off, you can't even count them. If you went to Liberia today or Sierra Leone, you would see an army, do you understand, of just people limbless. It was horrible fate. So that's a big help to Charles Taylor. As a result, Charles Taylor eliminates 2 of his rivals. And now he says to the people in Monrovia, the Nigerians are tired of being there anyway, I'm ready for an election. Are you? So it's 1996, July of 1996, they hold an election. Now the countryside is controlled by the troops of Charles Taylor. The crazy man Sanko and his group is what? Wandering around, and they're going to hold an election. Guess who wins? The person who wins is Charles Taylor. And in 1997, he becomes the elected president of Liberia. And I do want to tell you that Bill Clinton sent his congratulations. Hi, Charles. Because what? There's a rumor that there's also offshore oil in Liberia, and there's iron, and now there are diamonds also in Liberia. It's right next door to Sierra Leone, the whole thing. So, hi. Congratulations on your election. Oh, it's wonderful. And of course, this was a part of our campaign to support democracy all over the world. So, Charles Taylor, and I do want to tell you, is like Samuel Doe. It has to do with the job, I think, the megalomania that comes from it. I mean, he now lives high, and in fact, anybody who opposes him is eliminated. We're back into the same scene. Instead of having a qua, we now have somebody from the other group, that's all. It's the same scene. And in fact, there are people who oppose him, they're put in jail. Finally, the atrocities are so terrible because he also, imitating Sanko, takes 8-year-old boys and puts them into his army and gives them guns. And they love the power. Can you imagine, 8-year-old? Love the power. So now the world is absolutely outraged. And in fact, September 11th, 2001 has already occurred. And we want this area to be stable because Muslim fundamentalism is moving into sub-Saharan Africa where there are millions and millions of Muslims. Liberia has some Muslims. So now even America is concerned. Charles Taylor is what? Not so dangerous. Can't pull back the telegram of congratulations you sent him, and Clinton isn't in power anymore. Now it's George Bush Jr. So in 2003, a rebellion starts in Liberia, supported by most of the nations in West Africa and the United States of America, and ultimately, Charles Taylor is told by the president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, he's the big guy. He's got the biggest African nation in West Africa, 110 million people. He says to Taylor, you're going to have to resign, but it's okay. I won't disembowel you. You can come and live comfortably in Nigeria. So he resigns, he mumbles and grumbles and whatever it is, and in fact, a UN force now moves into Liberia, and they arrange for the first free election, most likely ever, in Liberia. In that election, two people run. One is a soccer star who can't spell his name. His name is George Weah. Oh, they love him. You know how they love soccer? The other is a woman. Her name is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. People think she's a member of the Creoles because she looks mulatto. And some of the people who came from America had already been, you know, were the product of what we call mixed racial unions, whatever. But she's not. Actually, her grandfather was a German who married one of the tribal women, did you understand? And so she's not part of the Creoles at all. People often confuse you. You see her face and you think, oh, she's part of the Creole aristocracy. She's not. She worked for the UN for many, many years. And she was educated in Liberia and outside Liberia. She's a widow and she's tough. And she decided to run, given the history of presidents of Liberia, you can get disemboweled after the elections, so whatever. And the polls seemed to indicate that Weah, who was the soccer star, was going to win, and also in particular because males in Liberia don't feel that women should be in charge. That's certainly part of African culture, so there's never been a female in charge of any African country. So now the news. She wins. She becomes the first woman president of any African nation. The soccer star says, oh, you rigged election. Shut up, George. It was supervised. It was the first free election in Liberia, and she now becomes the president of Liberia. Can she take this mess and do anything with it? So let me describe what Liberia is. When it was the Firestone Republic, at least there was law and order, and at least the economy was growing, even though the poor didn't benefit very much from it. But now, there's total devastation. I mean, whatever Firestone did, whatever airport he built or port, it's what? It's gone, it's destroyed. It's just a series of ruins. Two, the casualties are overwhelming. It's 250,000 killed. What about the number of people wounded? Without their limbs. And what about the refugees? There's the trauma. I mean, having lived all these years, since 1980, do you understand, it's been one long civil war. The whole concept of security is like people are nervous wrecks. There's a child disaster. Schools didn't function for years. Children were often taken into the army, where they were given guns, and where they experienced horrors that most children should never what? Be exposed to. The economy is stalled. Nothing can get exported. Are there diamonds? Yes. Is there timber? Yes. Is there offshore oil? Most likely. So you do anything in this kind of political environment. And the ethnic hostility is intense. The Creoles are hated by the Kwa and the Mandinka, and the Kwa hate the Mandinka, and the Mandinka hate the Kwa. Was that resolved by all of this? No. And there are no innocent people, because I want to tell you something about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. In the 1990s, she worked for Charles Taylor. He gave her a job and she took it. You know, I mean, she thought she could do some good, whatever. The point is, nobody's innocent. One thing that happened was that Sanko has been defeated in Sierra Leone. The terrible Charles Taylor was defeated in Liberia, and Sanko was defeated in Sierra Leone. That is the best news. I mean, the craziness and horror of what he did, which ultimately was picked up by Taylor. There is iron, diamonds, and oil available for anybody who could manage this place and what? Extract some kind of a profit, but it would require some kind of stability and some level of efficient management. 1 million, one-third of all the people of Liberia are now living in refugee camps, most of them in the Ivory Coast and in Guinea and even in Sierra Leone. Their homes have most likely been destroyed. It's not that their homes are so elaborate that they couldn't easily be rebuilt. It's just that what? They're gone. By the way, our government spent billions of dollars with trailers that are now parked. Do you understand? We paid all this money. They're now useless. Maybe we could ship a few of those trailers from the New Orleans Katrina disaster there. There is emigration. If you were well educated and Liberian, would you stay? Well, you say, well, aren't you an idealist? Yeah, I know, but you know, I mean, there's a limit. So a large part of what we call the educated Liberians have what? Left Liberia. They've come to the United States of America. They've gone to other parts of the world. Investment. Would you invest your money in Liberia? They need investment, by the way. They have a $3.5 billion debt, which they can't pay, and now they're looking for investment. So, and the last thing is certainly the reality. This is a sign of the African failure. Liberia is an example of lots of other countries, Sierra Leone, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. Getting African rulers, even though it's independent, hasn't improved the life of the people. Under the white colonialists, obviously, there was the dichotomy, but there was a certain level of law and order. So what are the implications for the future? Well, the United States of America has to take some responsibility for what happened. Our wonderful State Department encouraged us to support Samuel Doe. Of course, why not? And Charles Taylor. We did. Two nuts. The recovery of Liberia, I must tell you, will be enormously difficult. And one of the implications is the dilemma that's offered to Africa. The culture of Africa, like all culture historically, is not democratic. The history of Africa are chiefs who keep all the wealth and are revered as gods. You've got to break that tradition. And last, I do want to say, because I did not imagine that a well-educated, tough lady would become the president of Liberia. It seems for the first time that somebody sane, do you understand? Not engaged in violence, who now is experiencing international support, is in charge of Liberia. Will she be able to tame the Kwa, the Mandinka, the Creoles, make this country that isn't really a country make it what? Make it work. The very fact that the people of Liberia chose her over the soccer star. I want to tell you something. Do you understand? If you're looking for a sign of hope, that's what? That's the beginning of a sign of hope. But the dilemma of Africa is built in, Liberia is a little story which tells you the dilemma. The dilemma is that the people who become the ruling class, whether they come from the Creoles or whether they come from the tribes or whatever else it is, have been incapable of a kind of management that would raise the standard of living of people effectively. And the question is, the men having failed, will a woman in Liberia succeed? I certainly hope so. Thank you all very, very much. Have a great summer. Come here, Harry Cook, on July 13th, and I'll be back in